Capitalism as an expression, as a thought process, and as an ideological phenomenon, we see that it has emerged from certain ruins to a mature stage. That means there is a gradual progress that we have seen with regard to what is called as capitalism. And here I must convey that at its very rudimentary stage, we do see certain features emerging, and these important features clearly explain whether Mughal economy had any sort of early capitalism being built up, early capitalist structure being built up within the Mughal period. At least there are four important features that we must remember with regard to this so-called early capitalism. The first feature that emerges from the so-called merchant capitalism is that the entire production processes that you see will gradually get under the control of the capital. That means this first feature, control of capital over all the production processes, is the most important feature of this early capitalism. Second, as a simultaneous requirement of this first feature, we see the second feature in the form of the market relations or monetary relations. Whenever I invest capital in a particular production process, it leads to the accumulation of certain goods and services, and these goods must be sold at a price which is profitable to me. That means when I call it a price, it is important for me to have, rather than an exchange economy, but to have an economy which is monetized, which gives me the scope to take all these goods and services to every nook and corner of the region, to each and every person, such that I can earn the profit. Given this fact, unless and until it is monetized, it is impossible. And second, unless and until it is monetized, you cannot also have a strict market economy. If you are still going by this exchange-based economy, in this particular situation, the demand and supply, which have to act with all freedom as per this capitalist structure of the economy, will not act with all the freedom. There will be constraints. Unless and until you think you have the scope to get whatever the things that you are in demand for, you will not be able to exchange your goods which have been produced by you. And it is very difficult for you to search for those who can really provide you the goods that you are demanding. For example, you are in Sahara Desert. However, you are in demand for the tomatoes. You know that the possibility of tomatoes getting there is nearly zero. Then you have to wait for someone who produces these tomatoes in order to satisfy your need. That means when you have such exchange-based economy, it is very difficult for you to take your goods to a far-flung region to sell it for this exchange. And you know that this being a perishable good, it is impossible for you to take this particular good without proper infrastructure all the way back to your place. So there are certain inherent weaknesses that you see, because of which monetization of the economy, market-based relations are fundamental again in order to ensure that the control of capital over production processes is complete. That's how these two features are interdependent. There is a third feature which is interdependent on these first two features. Unless and until you have control over what is called as control of capital over the production processes, unless and until you have a monetized or market-based relations in the economy, you will not see this third feature. This third feature is all about the accumulation of the commodities. This accumulation of commodities is because of the fact that there is continuous rise in demand, and hence in order to meet that demand you start producing more and more, and as and when it gets accumulated, it means that you are becoming wealthy enough. That means the accumulation of wealth occurs within this particular production center, or a particular person who is owner of that particular production center, or through his capital, whoever is controlling those production processes. This accumulation of commodities hence leads to the accumulation of wealth. This is the third feature. The fourth feature is all these three would be possible only when there is breakthrough in technology. Unless and until there is a breakthrough technology, the possibility of these three features will not be there. And these three features cannot succeed to the extent of real accumulation which occurs until you see this production technology leads to some other breakthrough. We know that the merchants in this period of medieval India, particularly in the 17th and first half of the 18th century, they did possess considerable capital which cannot be brought into question. That's absolutely true. This is also evident from much of the European records which mention the estimate of their wealth. There are certain records which is not required for your examination. However, just I'll give you for your understanding. One of the records says that there were more than 600 merchants in Surat who owned in this first half of the 17th century more than 5 to 6 million rupees. That means there was immense wealth that these merchants carried, and hence we can clearly say that these merchants during this particular part of period possessed considerable capital. There is no question of doubting this. Second, besides this, as we know, merchants have put their entire money into commercial circulation. You know that the wealth of these merchants, along with the wealth of many non-mercantile groups that we see in the society, in the form of, for example, a zamindar, a zagirdar, that was also invested in many trading ventures. This included even the Mughal emperors, the royal ladies, princes, nobles. In fact, they did own their own ships. Even though their investment was less than that of the merchants. But the point that we have to remember here is that their involvement, whatever has been there in this entire trade scenario, that would definitely increase the monetary size within the economy in its own way. Because once an emperor also puts in money, there are many more people who will be ready to do that now. As there is so much of security that is offered psychologically by this investment by the emperor, by the investment of their own family members, the nobles. Third, given this development, you must also remember one more point. When this investment leads to so much of psychological security, then it's also an indication that the trade is going to flourish for a few number of years And here there would be many who would not have capital but would be invested towards their own venture into this trade. That's where you find that in this Mughal India, the system of credit, the system of banking becoming very well developed. There is an office called Sarraf, SARRAF, within the Mughal economy. Sarraf here was acting as a banker who would be remitting money. Sarraf here would also be issuing bills of exchange. These bills of exchange then used to be called as hundi. That means this office itself and its role and function clearly tells us that there is a system of credit and system of banking that was well developed during this Mughal period. And apart from this, we must also remember that the Sarraf also discounted the hundis of merchants, which would enlarge hence the scope and the volume of money for commerce. This is how we had the banking system, the credit system developed during the Mughal period. Apart from this, as this entire trade is being done through the marine route, we also find that there is also one more well developed financial practice. This well developed financial practice is all about the insurance of goods which are in transit. This initially developed for all those goods which are being in transit on land. Later it was extended to even those goods which are in transit through marine. Apart from Sarraf, this financial practice also tells us that there is much more security which is being given now to these goods which are in transit. Third point within this system of credit and banking, what is that? You also find that there is a well developed institutions of money lending. They lend money for some interest. And the purposes here are particularly the commercial purposes. That means with this system of credit and banking, with this office called Sarraf, whose role and functions, with this well-developed financial practice related to insurance of goods which are in transit, with these institutions of money lending which have been developed, all these entail that the basic financial and economic institutions which are required for economy to function in a more advanced way, to move forward towards the capitalism, did exist, and they exist in good measure. They also operated in good measure. In these first 2 points, we have tried to establish that there was enough capital. Second, we tried to establish that there were market relations. There were money-based relations. There is third point. Even this commodity production was also taking place on a vast scale. If you look at textiles, if you look at saltpeter, if you look at indigo, etc., have been produced on a vast scale. And apart from this, we also know that the procurement of these commodities was also made easier for both the Indian and foreign merchants by this institution called Institution of Brokering. That means clearly these relations were market-based relations but not based on any particular notion. There was no protective measure that was there. Clearly, the market-based relations were also getting established and the production of goods was also happening on a vast scale. And apart from this, one more requirement for such a trade to occur is the means of transport, and we find that given the constraints of these medieval times, the means of transport were also fairly well established, keeping in view these constraints of medieval times. That means all those important features that we see in the emergence of the capitalist structure were already there in this medieval part of the period, up to the decline of the Mughals. However, the fundamental difference that we see from the European capitalist structure and the Indian capital here is that true capitalist relations would develop only when the capital would dominate and control large areas of production processes. Unless and until the capital is dominating and controlling these large areas of production processes, you will not see the true capitalist relations getting emerged. In other ways, what I am trying to convey is there is a principal difference between the industrial capital and the merchant capital. In the industrial capital, what you see is it would dominate and control these large areas of production processes. With regard to merchant capital, what you find is this particular capital is not directly involved with the manufacture of goods. In other words, the production is not controlled by merchants. That means during this period of Mughals, even though there was vast capital which was available, this capital was not involved with the production processes, and production was not hence controlled by these merchants who owned this much of the capital. It was carried out by those independent artisans who owned their tools, who invested their money in buying the raw material, and also who worked at their respective homes, which is called as domestic craft system. And they also owned these finished goods which are sold later at the market by these merchants. That means what we observe here is still this merchant capital has not penetrated the manufacture of goods. Capitalism, when it emerges thoroughly in terms of its structure, the true capital relations would develop only when the capitalism destroys all these features and turns these independent artisans into the wage workers. That means industrial capital takes over gradually the entire means of production and starts controlling the entire system. There will not be any possibility of having an independent artisan producing goods. He will come under the complete influence of such capital, and either he had to sell off his particular venture or he had to lose his fortunes. Within this binary of choices available, he would be ready to sell off his venture and starts converting himself as a wage worker. This entire capitalistic tendencies that we must see in order to have our own capitalist structure in terms of industrial capitalism did not emerge during this 17th century and first half of 18th century. The changeover from the merchant capitalism to industrial capitalism cannot happen abruptly, as I said, cannot happen suddenly. That means there has to be some transitory phase between this merchant capitalism and the industrial capitalism, and this transitory phase is fundamental in ensuring that merchant capitalism is leading to the industrial capitalism, and this particular system is called as putting out system. What is this putting out system? Putting out system is nothing but a scenario where you find that the merchant capitalists invest some money in rural areas, particularly those home-based workers that they can obtain, whereby these home-based workers will be asked to produce the goods, and these home-based workers would be earning wages for whatever the goods that they have produced. This they will do in a penetrating manner in such a way that each and every household in rural area probably would emerge as the wage earners by producing these goods to meet whatever the demand that is already persisting in the market. And you know that already everything has been monetized. There is a systematic development of finance, there is a systematic development of insurance, there is a development of means of transport, and there is also clear development of system of credit and banking within the economy. Given this situation, if this transitory phase of putting this entire merchant capital into these rural areas of production, incipiently at the rudimentary level, you would see that the production process is being controlled by the capital. This is at the rudimentary stage. You will not still see the emergence of the machinery. However, once these all rural people have been brought under the fold of earning some wage by producing these goods, you find that the capital is not yet satisfied. It has to meet much more demand such that it can earn more and more profit. This is where they start looking at the feature named the intrusion of production technologies. Unless and until these breakthroughs are achieved in the production technologies, you cannot see the next leap in terms of the production of those goods which can give them more and more profit. Here also, you must remember that the Mughal system had a particular or similar system which is called as Dadni system, D-A-D-N-I. This Dadni system was quite an established practice. However, it was occurring on a small scale. Or to put it differently, even though it was occurring on a small scale, as I said, it was quite an established practice. This is similar to what is called as putting out system. That means the penetration of merchant capital into the existing artisan level mode of production could occur through this our Indian version of putting out system called as Dadni system, because as I said, it's a quite an established practice even though on a small scale, even prior to the 17th century. That means we had an incipient putting out system that was emerging in the Mughal economy. However, what we see here is again the emergence of these persons named brokers. You find that these brokers would come into picture because the advances to the primary producers by the merchants were made only through them. Without brokers, the Dadni system would not have happened in India. Here I must also point out the economic structure that we had during this period. We know that the Indian economy during the 17th century was clearly a seller's paradise. Seller's paradise in the sense that the producers would sell their goods and make huge chunk of money. They could do so because there was tremendous demand, and apart from that, there were groups of people who can be concluded as competitive buyers. That means there were large number of competitive buyers who were flooding the market. Thus, from the merchant's point of view, That means especially of those who are engaged in this foreign trade. Clearly, there was lot of demand and large number of competitive buyers who are also there from the foreign market. First point. Second point. When I said that we had a rudimentary putting out system called Dadni system, which ensures what? Which ensures that whatever the competition that they may face in terms of having some rivals, this putting out system for all those who are engaged especially in foreign trade excludes their rivals, and hence it secures them of timely delivery of stipulated quantity of commodity in accordance with the specifications which are agreed at previously agreed rates. That means it simplifies this entire process for the merchant who is involved especially in this foreign trade in such a way that in the competition he is well above these rivals because rivals are already excluded. Second, in this competition he also secures him of the timely delivery of this stipulated quantity of commodity. Third, he could ensure this timely delivery because there is a specification which has been agreed, and the specification which has been agreed was on the basis of certain previously agreed prices or rates. Apart from this, there is one more aspect that you must remember. Here comes the primary producer. As we see that the merchant is already at an advantage because of this Dadni system where he could eliminate all those rivals, hence could make lot of profit. On the other hand, you have a producer who is a primary producer who has also accepted advances since he had to cope with these extensive orders for which he may not have adequate money to buy raw materials. That means within our putting out system called Dadni system, merchants were looking for goods and the primary producers were producing those goods. Given this Dadni system in which the primary producer has been given certain advance to produce the goods and services, or rather goods about which there are extensive orders which are lying, he might not have adequate capital to produce all these goods. That means he had to accept these advances. This is where with this advance he will be continuously producing, and those who are into this system of Dadni, that means the merchants who are into the system of Dadni, are readily having the goods necessary for carrying on this entire trade by them, particularly the foreign trade, to make enough wealth. Can we call this cash advance which was given a control of capital over the production process? Second, we must also examine whether the merchant has an advance in cash predominantly, or as we know this cash is used in fact for supply of raw materials. Is he also advancing the raw materials, or is the merchant advancing not only cash but also raw materials, both? Second, has this merchant advanced the tools of production to the artisan? These two questions must be examined to know whether the putting out system in India called as Dadni system was ready to convert itself structurally to invite the industrial capitalism. Here, you observe that the adequate evidence for advance being given in cash as an established practice can be found, particularly pertaining to, for example, the textile industry. And at the same time, we must also remember that in this case of textiles, the need for giving raw material, that is yarn, to the weavers was also seen. This need arises particularly from the consideration that the yarn which was obtained by the weavers themselves on the basis of these cash advances was often of inferior quality. That means some profit accrues to the weaver when he himself purchases the yarn or raw silk of a particular quality, however, which is questionable from the merchant's point of view. So it may be reasonably assumed that the weaver did not always welcome the supply of raw material from the merchant, as this possibly wiped off whatever that little extra profit that they would earn. I think you are getting my point. That means whatever that predominant form of putting out system that we had was based on these cash advances. Now the question that has to be examined here is that can this practice of cash advances lead to transformation in the relations of production? This is the important question that we must address. If you observe the entire evidence that we have, particularly whatever the large scale evidence that we get both from Gujarat and Bengal in terms of those various periods during which they were dominant in this entire trade aspect, we cannot have any convincing evidence to conclude that this system of Dadni has ever acquired a very dominant form of putting out system that we see in Europe. Even though the possibility of development of a strong capitalistic relationship was there, we find that this could not develop. This could not develop because of various reasons. Before looking at those reasons, we must conclude first that the most distinguishing feature of the putting out system that India had in this Dadni system during the 17th century was this practice of cash advance predominantly. Even though we hear of supply of raw material, we hear of this supply of raw material particularly when these artisans who are producing these goods have chosen the raw material which is of inferior quality. In order to have the quality rich goods being produced, now the merchant is at compulsion to supply the raw material. However, here I have also pointed out that whenever such raw material is supplied, the producer or the artisan had to get compromised with whatever that little extra profit or extra benefit that he may earn by choosing the raw material by himself. Given this fact, he would definitely resist the involvement of merchant in choosing the raw material. That means it is also because of this particular dominant reason we find that this entire feature called cash advances was predominantly there in our putting out system during the 17th century. This remains to be the most distinguishing feature. From here, it raises one more question. Now the question is, if this is the notable feature of putting out system during 17th century in terms of practice of cash advances, then is this practice of cash advance was sufficient to transform the relations of production such that the industrial capitalism could emerge? Here, we must hence look at what is the primary motive of giving these cash advances to the artisan, and at the same time, what is this primary motive for artisan to accept these cash advances rather than any other feature that could emerge in this putting out system? Primarily, you must observe here that the cash advances were being preferred by these artisans, and this has been a distinct tendency because the merchants have this practice everywhere to intervene deliberately in the production process in such a manner that would ultimately kill the independence of these home-based producers in the form of artisans. That is where their intervention continuously would lead to a radical change in the relationships of production. That means ultimately the producer gets tied to the merchant in all obligation to just fulfill that entire commitment. However, in case of India, we find that this did not emerge because artisan was accepting cash advances to keep himself from this tendency of merchants intervening deliberately in the production process, number one. Number two, in order to ensure this, what artisan must do? Artisan must retain the ownership of the tools of production. The artisan must retain the ownership of raw materials. Given this fact, once you own the tools of production, once you own the raw materials, whatever the cash advance payment that he is receiving from the merchant is being used for getting this raw material by himself at his free will. And at the same time, he also sold off his entire produce in return for such advance payment, again out of his free will. There was no compulsive element. And at the same time, we do not see in terms of evidence the existence of any extraordinary economic compulsion. For example, as an artisan, if you are reeling under any poverty, then that economic compulsion will push you to accept any terms and conditions which are put forward by the merchant capital. However, except in very few occasions where you find certain extraordinary economic compulsion existing, For an artisan, there is no such compulsion, which is extraordinary in its sense, to accept the orders from the merchant, which would ultimately lead to the control of the merchant over the artisan. And at the same time, we also observe that the possibility of merchants employing non-economic coercion to compel the artisan to enter into a compulsive deal to transform, or at least which would ultimately transform the relationship of production, was also not there. What we instead see is that merchant was under compulsion to induce the producer to accept this advance payment in his own interest. That means clearly it was not the merchant who was in an advantageous position to transform the relationship, but it was this artisan, the producer, who was in this advantageous position. Unless and until merchant is in the advantageous position to transform the relationship between the merchant and the producer, you cannot see the emergence of industrial capital. What we see here is different from what is required for the emergence of industrial capitalism. We don't see in this larger chunk the presence of any kind of economic bondage. We don't see in its larger chunk the presence of any kind of economic dependence. We don't see in its larger chunk the presence of any physical coercion by the merchant towards the producer or the artisan. We don't see in its largest chunk the presence of merchant monopoly with regard to the relations between the merchant and the producer. That means the artisan here, to put it in simple terms, was clearly a contract producer, number one. And number two, at the same time, he was also independent. Even though he was not owner of his produce, we must remember that he is not yet alienated from the ownership of both raw material and the tools of production. Here you recall that first important feature. If this industrial capitalism had to emerge in terms of capitalist structure, we must remember that the capital must control the entire production processes. Here, what we see is capital is controlling only the produce that has been produced by the owner, except that he is still under the control of the raw material, he is still under the control of the tools of production. This is fundamental reason why you don't see the emergence of industrial capitalism in India from whatever the merchant capital that was present. Is there any question till now? Here you might ask me, when I use this expression, contract producer, is it not a transformation that we are seeing? That means, to an extent, whatever that independent status of the primary producer that I was referring to has been encroached upon by this putting out system that we have in the form of Dadni system in India. That means to that extent there is a level of transformation. But as I said, when capital controls the entire production processes, it means that you are no more a producer, but you are a contract worker. Here what we see is that even though there is a contract, you are still a contract producer but not a contract worker. You have not become a wage earning labor within the capitalist structure. You must also remember one more aspect. From the artisan end, there was one advantage. As I already told you, there was consistent enlargement of demand. And this consistent enlargement of demand would ask for flooding of the production into the market. That means the primary producer, because of the presence of a large number of competitive buyers in the market, because of which there is a huge demand, is clearly in a favorable situation. And we also observe that there is any absence of any extraordinary economic compulsion. There is any presence of non-economic coercion which would have left the artisans to strike a deal with whomsoever it is considered best, such that it will sell off all its capital goods and emerge as a contract worker under the control of the industrial capital. You must also remember one more point. This economic compulsion or physical coercion was also absent because whichever might be the political power that was ruling these regions, they knew that trade is fundamentally important for their exchequer to be full, to take up whatever the welfare measures that they want to take up. Given this fact, you would know that in spite of lot of political turbulence, these merchants by and large remained unaffected by such political turbulence. Hence, there was no emergence of any kind of dependence or economic bondage in this part of the period. And if you observe, because of this lack of transformation from the merchant capital to industrial capital, through this transitory phase called Dadni system or putting out system, we find that simultaneously the possibility of emergence of any breakthrough in production technology did not occur in India particularly. When you find that capital is controlling the entire production processes, during the process of which we also find that the economy has been thoroughly monetized and it has become the market based, you observe that there is clear accumulation of these goods that are produced must occur in order to earn this zeal to earn more and more profit. That means it is at this juncture you are also in requirement of a breakthrough in production technology. We observe that as this did not happen in Indian case in terms of these three very important steps of that initial phase of capitalism, we did not see the emergence of the fourth step at all in the Indian scenario. Now you bring in the entire discussion that we had yesterday. This capitalist structure could not emerge primarily because whatever those independent merchants that we have seen pertaining to the indigenous people, they tried to be independent on a fairly higher degree, even though, as I said, there is a kind of encroachment that has happened to their independence by transforming them into contract producer. The control of capital over the entire production processes did not emerge, except that there are certain cash advances and occasionally there is provision of this raw material. But however, this independence of the artisan or the primary producer was clearly intact, because of which and because of whose rather quoted unquote greediness to retain this independence, we observe that could not be encroached upon by the merchant capital. Second, as there is diversified competitive buyers in the market, even though it has been monetized, even though the institutions which have been well developed are existing, we observe that primary producer is clearly at an advantage over the merchant. Now the merchant had to make just the profit, but he cannot vie for controlling this entire production processes, even though we do observe that there are certain developments in the sense that the merchant capital was also producing simultaneously. They were very, very rare, scarce. They did not have the wherewithal to transform this entire process in such a way that the economy itself becomes dependent upon capital. That entire phase did not emerge because of this very rudimentary Dadni system that we had pertaining to these fundamental aspects of control over entire processes of production, including the raw materials. In terms of whatever that philosophical base, theoretical base that we built in the yesterday's discussion, if I have to look at this particular scenario of inability of this Dadni system leading to the emergence of industrial capitalism in India, this is what we have to conclude. Whenever you have such a process of transformation set in, remember that this process must clear the way for capitalist system, whereby this entire process can gradually and incrementally take away from the laborer, in our case the artisan or the primary producer, the possession of his means of production, number one, the possession of the raw materials. That means in India, during this Mughal economy, what we observe is, in terms of society, in terms of social dimension, the subsistence and independence, they were never separate. They were together. Once they are together, and once you also know that the conditions prevailing in the society keep them together continuously, where I said that there are multiple avenues in terms of demand for this producer to sell his goods. That means once you see that there are multiple avenues, what we are trying to convey that they also have their own subsistence pattern. That means all these goods which are produced at various places are getting converged at this particular marketplace, and it is getting exchanged through this monetary system which is present. Given this, we are saying that this subsistence and independence was thoroughly there within the system. It is this which could not be broken, because mere cash advances does not mean that there is control over the processes of production and the control over the raw material. That means subsistence and the independence has kept this primary producer, who is the indigenous one, as an independent one. He is primarily the indigenous producer. He remained autonomous in both these senses. That is where this subsistence and also the production, both including the raw materials, could not be transformed into the capital. This is where, whenever such possibility might generate, even incipiently, you find that this entire aspect of producer could not be transformed into the wage laborer. If the strict industrial capital structure has to emerge, the subsistence must itself get transformed. The subsistence of the earlier nature must get killed. His independence must get killed. These two did not occur, and hence these immediate producers could not be transformed into the wage laborers, the wage earners. This is where this subsistence as a social dimension, production as a social dimension, could not be transformed themselves into capital. As this Mughal economy has failed to emerge itself, transform into such industrial capitalist based economy, there is enough space and void that you see, which has definitely given an opportunity for these colonial rulers to just grab. By now, we observe that while we are still reeling under this merchant capital, the Europe has transformed itself into the industrial capital. And as I said, when you are looking at subsistence and production as a social dimension, where they are retaining their independence, we find that the greediness is limited, self-interest is limited, because at the individual level, what he can produce is also limited. But once you see that this has transformed itself into capital, this capital leads us to this next scenario. What is that? The fourth dimension, the breakthrough in production technology. And when this occurs, your greediness gets transformed. It becomes so much self-interested that it remains always self-interested. Once it happens, you will try to earn as much as possible. You will try to generate wealth as much as possible for your own benefit and for your own selfish interest. We did not see this emerging in the Indian scenario because this subsistence and production as social dimensions did not transform themselves into capital as a social dimension. That is where the greediness was not as much as you see in Europe, which have then transformed themselves into the capital. Given this scenario, you now see a bulk production occurring at Europe. That's where this entire production gets dumped into the markets which are getting generated now. As you know, those three fundamental requirements in the form of the production processes and the control of capital. Number two, what is called as the presence of market economy, the presence of monetized economy, which is the basis for such market economy. And third, more importantly, the accumulation of this production of material, production of goods, was already set in as conditions in the Mughal economy. It was definitely easy for these European producers to dump their goods, which have become very cheap now because of this breakthrough in production technology, and they can dump as much as possible as it is being produced by the machinery now, rather than your individual labor, even though it is subsistence based and even though it is based on the control over the production by the artisan. That means this was possible because he was still independent. This independence was lost in Europe, because of which the possibility of controlling the entire market definitely was there when I look at them from again the social dimensions. Is there any question or is it clear? Now you will see all the asymmetries of power coming into play. Under these conditions of greediness, even if you talk of law and order, it is to fulfill this greediness. Even if you talk of justice, it is to fulfill this greediness. Even if you talk of any such value which is objective and universal according to them, it is to fulfill this particular selfish interest. It will be used to interpret their own need, their own desire.